Hello, welcome to Phenomenology. I'm Mark Thorsby. In this video, we'll be taking a look at Part 1, Division 1, second chapter of Heidegger's seminal text, Being in Time. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. In the last video, we were taking a look at Heidegger's understanding of what an existential analytic of Dasein is not, right? It's not psychology, it's not anthropology, it's not biology. It's not a philosophy of life or a philosophy of anthropology, right? And nor is it simply just an analysis of Dasein and its primitive structure, right? So in this section, what we're going to be taking a look at, well, also we saw at the end of the last section, Heidegger's emphasis that ultimately, before we can really understand Dasein's average everydayness, we have to understand the sense in which Dasein is engaged in the world, which means we have to understand what we're talking about when we talk about the world. So in this section, we're going to look at chapter 2 here, being in the world in general as the basic state of Dasein. Okay, so let's jump into it. So this is sort of long. It's only 2 paragraphs we're going to be taking a look at in this video. Paragraph 12 is a preliminary sketch of being in the world in terms of an orientation towards being in as such. And I didn't do a good job here, but when we talk about being in the world and being, because remember, Dasein's average everyday manner of involvement is one in which we're in the world, we're phenomenally absorbed into the world in terms of our conscious intention and in terms of what we call our comportment. And this is a type of being, it's a type of living, a type of existing. Now, but being in the world is essential to the whole analysis, but we have to understand what being means. We have to understand what being in means, and we have to also understand what world means, worldhood. And when we can put these together, we're going to ultimately understand, we'll have a sort of a starting point with which to build up this analysis of Dasein. Now, one of the things here is when we talk about being in the world, this is a unitary phenomena. This is one thing that's unified, right? So while this unity can't be stitched together because it's not components, it's all one thing, we can distinguish the constitutive structural elements. That is, we can identify and think about what are the structural elements that constitute Dasein's being in the world. Or as Heidegger writes, quote, being in the world cannot be broken up into contents which may be pieced together. But this doesn't prevent it from having several constitutive items in its structure. That is, Dasein has a structure, and we're going to be taking a look at uncovering what it is. Now, as I mentioned, there's 3 moments of analysis. The analysis of worldhood, what it means to be in the world, the analysis of the entity that's in the world, the who, and then there's the analysis of what it means to be in, the being in part. Okay, and of course our question there is, well, what does that mean? Now, so let's start there. Well, what does it mean to talk about being in? Well, Heidegger says, okay, well, let's compare an ordinary conception. Let's think about when we say water's in the glass. Normally I have a water glass here, I don't have one. But when I have water and there's in the glass, what I'm saying that it's in something, or think about if I also say that the book is in the bookshelf or on the bookshelf, or if I say the present is in the box or the person is in the car, all of these signify a spatial relation of location, right? So, because what we're talking about is 2 entities that are extended in space, and they have to each other with regard to their location of space, right? So there's 2 entities. There's the glass and there's the water, and one of the entities has a specific location of in within the other entity, right? Now, but a location of in can always be expanded, right? So think about this. There's glass that's in the water, but that can be in the lecture hall, and the lecture hall can be in the building, and the building can be in the university, and the university can be in the city, which can be in the world, which can be in the solar system, and on and on and on, right? So you see here that when we talk about spatial locations, when we talk about inness, there's always a possibility for expansion there, right? So any entity that can be in another is always in the world, right? So when we talk about what it means to be in the world, we can first recognize this. Now, ultimately, Heidegger he's going to, well, I'll go through it here, but he's ultimately going to articulate a different conception of spatiality. He's not going to do that for us in this video, but he will start to get close to it. Let's take a look at this quote from Heidegger's Pagination 54. Quote, being present at hand in something which is likewise present at hand, and being present at hand along with the Mitvorhandensein, right, in the sense of a definite location relationship with something else which has the same kind of being, are ontological characteristics which we call categorial. Okay, and they are of such a sort as to belong to entities whose kind of being is not of the character of Dasein. So when I think of the pen, right, and being present at hand as something existing, and then I think of it as being within my little pen cup here, right? All of these are locations that can be expanded, and they have categorical relations to each other. But here's the thing: is this is not Dasein. This is not Dasein because Dasein is given in its average everydayness fundamentally, which is not present at hand, right? So that means that when we talk about being in, we're not talking about the same thing as the cup, the water in the cup, or the pen in the jar. Being in is a state of Dasein's being, which is what Heidegger calls an existential, right? So being in is actually a state of Dasein's being. It's not simply a categorical determination. So being in is a form of being along with other beings, right? So when I say I'm in the world, I'm not talking about my location as such, even though I have a location. I'm talking in a primordial sense of the fact that I'm with other things in the world. Because remember, Dasein's being ultimately is related to the phenomena of Dasein's consciousness, right? And the fact that we're with other things, this is not a present at hand identification, right? So the fact that I'm sitting here with the computer and I'm in a world with you, I'm not identifying something in a categorical way. I'm not designating a categorical relationship, right? I'm talking about the way that my manner of existence is predicated presumptively upon the idea that I'm with other things in the world. I'm not in them in terms of some sort of hierarchy, right? Again, this is his argument against the philosopher's tendency to jump to theory and to create a theoretical series of designations and categorical determinations. He says this is not Dasein, so stop already, right? Being alongside the world in the sense of being absorbed in the world is an existential that's founded upon being in. So the fact that I'm absorbed in the world actively is ultimately what he means by this being in, when he talks about we're beings in the world. Heidegger writes, quote, as an existential, being alongside the world never means anything like being present at hand together of things that occur. There's no such thing as the side-by-sideness of an entity called Dasein with another entity called the world, right? It's not that here's the world and here's Dasein and they're along each other. It's rather that Dasein is absorbed into the world along with and next to other things that are also absorbed in the world. He continues, an entity present at hand within the world can be touched by another entity only if, by its very nature, the latter entity has being in as its own kind of being. Only if, with its being there, Dasein, right? Something like the world is already revealed to it, so that from out of that world, another entity can manifest itself in touching, and thus become accessible in its being present at hand. I think in order to simplify this, what I want you to keep in mind here is that for Heidegger, being in is not a theoretical conceptual delineation here. It is rather a mode and a manner of involvement. It's a mode of absorption into the world in terms of Dasein's average everyday modality, right? So, by the way, when we talk about the present at hand, entities that are present at hand in themselves are wordless. So when I think about the pen's existence insofar as it is a pen, and I turn it into a conceptual thematic, right? The pen is no longer something in the world, right? It's worldless in a certain way, right? And you can think this is what philosophers all the way since Plato have been doing. And this is why in the introduction to Being and Time, Heidegger calls for the destruction of Western metaphysics. Because if Dasein is a being in the world, we can't analyze Dasein this way in which philosophers have classically done it. Because the classic philosopher's conception of man as a rational animal is ultimately a worldless conception of the human being. So to understand Dasein as living alongside things in the world, and then to comport oneself towards Dasein in the present at hand, is ultimately to understand Dasein in terms of its facticity, right? So let me read that again. To understand Dasein as living alongside things in the world, and then to comport oneself towards Dasein in the present under hand, and in terms of the present at hand, is to understand Dasein in terms of its facticity. So when I do put Dasein, when I think about, for instance, my children, and I put them into the present at hand, that is to treat Dasein not in terms of its being in the world, but in terms of its facticity. And Heidegger defines facticity as the factuality of the fact. That is, it is what makes the fact, right? And so when we think about Dasein as present at hand, we're thinking about Dasein's facticity. And this is a definite way of being for Dasein. Quote, the concept of facticity implies that an entity within the world has being in the world in such a way that it can understand itself as bound up in its destiny with the being of those entities which it encounters within its own world. Okay? This is his conception of facticity. We're going to see this stuff, we're going to come back to this later, and we'll explain it again. One of the things you'll find as you read Heidegger is that at the beginning of each paragraph, Heidegger always starts by sort of re-summarizing everything up to that point, but by slowly building up these summarizations where you eventually start to understand the usage of Heidegger's language, right? But there is a way in which Heidegger is making an important difference here. On the one hand, we can talk about being in terms of an existential, and we can talk about the idea of insideness, right? And these are not the same concepts. Heidegger is not denying every form of spatiality. So even though Heidegger is saying that that Dasein's being in the world is not like the water that's in the glass. It's not just a spatial location. For Dasein, the existential of being in does have a domain of spatiality included within it. But we're going to see it's talking about the spatiality of involvement, the involvement in the comportment of Dasein's consciousness. So we're gonna talk about this much later in much clearer details, because Heidegger is going to lay out his own conception of what he means by space. So he's not denying all forms of spatiality, but he does say on 56, not until we understand being in the world as an essential structure of Dasein can we really have any insight into Dasein's existential spatiality. So we can't really go into what we're talking about in terms of existential space until we first understand what it means being in the world means, which means we've got a whole bunch of things to do. Now, Dasein's existential being in gets dispersed. So the way in which Dasein is in the world, and remember, being in means the manner in which we're absorbed and involved with things that are alongside Dasein in the world. It gets dispersed through different forms of activities, through different manners of existence, and different modes of involvement. So some of these examples, for instance, when you have to do with something, having to do with something, producing something, attending to something, when you're looking after something, you're watching someone's dog, when you're making use of something, say for instance you're cooking, you're using pots, when you're giving something up, you stop smoking, when you let something go, your lover leaves you, right? When you're undertaking something, for instance, you're undertaking this course, when you accomplish something, for instance, when you're evincing, interrogating, considering, discussing, determining, and on and on and on. You can certainly probably add your own elements to this, right? Because Dasein's in the world in the sense that it's absolved and absorbed into the world and involved with the things that it finds alongside itself within the world. And this gets dispersed through a whole myriad sense of activities. And notice that all of these examples that Heidegger gives, these are all things we do on an average everyday level. These are things that we normally do not consider as philosophically significant, but that's precisely the point. They are so significant that they've been reified and we don't really recognize them as anything of importance, but they're critical and crucial because they are, if you will, symptoms of Dasein's a priori fundamental structure. Because what do all of these examples show? Well, they show concern. They show the idea that Dasein is engaged in the world, and we can use this conception of concern. So Dasein's being alongside things in the world indicates an existential mode of concern by Dasein. And by the way, we can distinguish, when we're talking about concern, we can distinguish proficient and deficient modes of concern. So something is proficient if you're actively trying to do it. Something is deficient if you're not really that concerned with it. In fact, he defines deficiency here as a concern at the bare minimum, right? So for instance, think about something right now that you are not really concerned with. I mean, you can be concerned with it in the sense that it's on the horizon of possible things for you to think about, but you're not really that concerned with it. So for instance, the grass that's growing outside, cutting the grass, I'm not really concerned with it at the moment, so it is still in my mode of concern, but it's a deficient concern, right? It's concern at a bare minimum or something like this. So when we talk about Dasein's concern in the world, there's not only is there the ways in which Dasein's existential gets dispersed, but there's also, if you will, a spectrum to greater or lesser degrees of concern. And of course, as Dasein moves from one task to another, that spectrum or that scale of concern shifts accordingly. So that means that Dasein has an ontological structure of care. And we mentioned this, I think, at the beginning of the last video. But it's important to recognize that care is not the ordinary concept of care, because he's thinking of care here as an existential. So being in, now let's put it this way, being in is not a property that Dasein sometimes have and sometimes does not have. Dasein is always in the world, and Dasein is always involved in the world. And how so? Well, taking up relationships towards the world is possible only because Dasein, as a being in the world, is as it is. We can only take up relations in the world because Dasein has the being that allows it to be in the world, right? It has a world-like being, a worldly being, right? And that being is an ontological determination. So being in has taken now the character of knowing the world, a present at hand comportment. So there is a way in which when we say that we know things in the world, right, and we know them in terms of the present at hand, theoretical determinations and so forth, those are also predicated as a type of care, as a type of manner of involvement. So here you can see there's the present at hand, but the present at hand is founded upon something that has to be more fundamental. And you can see here is that what Heidegger's doing is slowly working his way into this conception. Now, paragraph 13, and I believe this is where we're going to end our discussion today, is where Heidegger discusses a founded mode in which being in is exemplified, that is, knowing the world. This is, if you will, the paragraph where some of what Heidegger says has direct relevance to questions pertaining to epistemology. Epistemology concerns our theory of knowledge, but here, instead of giving a theory of knowledge, what Heidegger is doing is saying that every theory of knowledge, every epistemology, and every activity of trying to know the world is always a manner that exemplifies the fact that Dasein is a being in. That is, Dasein is comporting itself alongside and towards things in the world. Now put it this way, if being in the world is a basic state of Dasein, then it must be something that's always experienced, right? Because every experience requires it, because it's always there because it's a basic state. So despite the potential veiling of this ontical condition, it actually is something that's always in view. So knowing must, that I typed in twice, so knowing must have the phenomenal character of being in the world, regardless of any sort of subject-object problem that a modern philosopher would make. So, but knowing here, knowing is not here present at hand, right? We haven't really talked about knowing in the present at hand yet. So let's sort of run through his discussion of knowledge. If knowing is at all, it belongs solely to those entities which know. But even in those entities, these human things, knowing is not present at hand. In any case, it's not externally ascertainable as, well, let us say, bodily properties are. Now, inasmuch as knowing belongs to these entities and is some external characteristic, it must be inside, right? But what the subject knows is not inside like a box, right? Think here about the subject-object difference. I'm a subject, and all the things outside of my imminent consciousness are what we might call objects, right? But to know something is not like having something in my consciousness, like putting something in a box, right? Consider that knowing something immanently or transcendently, right? To know something like well, think of Husserl's designation of imminent consciousness. When I'm conscious of the imminent, something that's present before me at the moment that it's present before me, right? Knowing it is not like having it inside my subjectivity. Knowing is more like being with it, right? Knowing has to be clarified, really, what this term of knowledge is. And here we're also talking about the founded mode of knowing, the mode of knowing in terms of the being in, separate from the present at hand, though the present at hand is derivative of it, right? And we have to understand, number one, is how knowing is, and also what knowing is, right? How is it possible, and what is it? Well, knowing is grounded beforehand in a being alongside the world, which is essentially constitutive for Dasein's being. I think we've covered that already. So that means that being already alongside is not a fixed starting point in the present hand, right? Dasein is fascinated by the world in which it's concerned, right? Dasein is concerned because it's curious, right? If knowing is to be possible as a way of determining the nature of the present at hand by observing it, then there must first be a deficiency in our having to do with the world concernfully. Remember, deficiency here is, what did he say it was? It's concern at a bare minimum, right? And so you can see here the nature of the present at hand is ultimately related to a deficiency in our having to do with the world concernfully. So when I see the pen and I treat it as something present in consciousness, that's possible only because there's a way in which I can deficient, or I can reduce to a bare minimum, the concern I have with the other entities that are alongside with me in the world. So that means that knowing something ultimately is about holding back, sort of. So when concern holds back, then we're only left with Dasein's tearing alongside with another entity. So this is where Heidegger is really trying to articulate what he means by a bare minimum of care, a bare minimum of concern. I just don't carry alongside it. I'm just with it. I'm just not really concerned with it, right? And this sort of movement allows the pen to become present at hand, and I can know something about it, right? So Dasein will treat other beings only insofar as they look. They have an eidos to Dasein. So to tarry alongside something is not to be concerned with it, really, but or to be concerned at the bare minimum. It is just to sort of treat it as what I see it as. And here we're not talking about seeing necessarily, though certainly when I see something, I just treat it as such. That's what he means by tarrying alongside. And what this tarrying alongside means is that it has the character of approaching other entities from a definite direction, or an approach that takes on a definite viewpoint towards other beings. And what Heidegger seems to be articulating here is that in Dasein's mode of involvement in the world, there is an intentionality, right? There is a definite directedness towards which our concern it moves about, right? So that means that a mode of looking at things reveals that Dasein dwells. Dasein has a mode of dwelling. And we're going to see, especially as we read Heidegger in his later paragraphs, that dwelling is one of these really essential characteristics, and I think existential discoveries that he makes, right? Now, in this kind of dwelling, quote, in this kind of dwelling as a holding oneself back from any manipulation or utilization, the perception of the present at hand is consummated. So when I recognize the pen as present at hand, there's a dwelling, but there's a dwelling in which I am not going to be consumed with anything else, and I hold back from everything else, right? I hold back from that which I am alongside with those things in the world. Perception is consummated when one addresses oneself to something as something and discusses it as such. This amounts to interpretation in the broadest sense. And on the basis of such interpretation, perception becomes an act of making determinate, right? So that's really quite important here, right? What is thus perceived and made determinate can be expressed in propositions and can be retained and preserved in what has thus been asserted. The perceptive retention of an assertion about something is itself a way of being in the world. It is not to be interpreted as a procedure by which a subject provides itself with representations, Vorstellungen, of something which remain stored up inside as having been thus appropriated, and with regard to which the being of how they agree with actuality can occasionally arise. End quote from page 62. That's kind of a long quote, and maybe there's a little too long for our purposes. But his basic idea here is that even when I know the world in the present at hand, that is really a type of interpretation that is really founded upon our being in the world. And you can see what Heidegger's doing in this passage is he's really slowly trying to get us to see that when we have this tendency to treat man as a rational animal, that the rational animal part is actually predicated upon our being alongside other things in the world. And to treat human beings as just a rational animal, to put them into the present at hand, is still a mode of interpretation. And guess what? This sort of range of analysis of Heidegger's has direct implications and is directly descriptive of perception itself. Perception itself. Because the present at hand reveals a mode of perception. Right? So what's the gist here? At the end of the day, what do we have to say? Number one, Dasein is outside, it's in the world. Dasein's not in the mind, right? When you think of cogito ergo sum, you think of your existence as in the mind somehow. We have to reject this, because all of that is a present at hand mode, which is founded upon the being in as such of the world. Dasein is out in the world. Dasein's engaged. Dasein is carrying alongside and is concerned with things in the world. The way in which to think of something theoretically is to detach oneself with Dasein's concern for things in the world. That is, to bring to a bare minimum its concern for things in the world. So the perceiving of what is known is not a process of returning with one's booty to the cabinet of consciousness after one has gone out and grasped it. And here's the basic idea, is really since Descartes, we've had this conception in modern philosophy that to gain knowledge is to sort of go out in the world, grab something through our senses, put it in consciousness, and then make sense of it here. And Heidegger is saying that is completely the wrong paradigm. It's completely upside down. The correct paradigm is to recognize that we're out in the world, and that when we make theoretical constructions of knowing things and perceiving those things, it's not that we're bringing them in the world, it's rather that while we're out in the world, we just bring to a bare minimum, and we push things into the recesses, into the background of our perception. So Dasein is in the world, both in its perception and in its knowledge. So knowing is a mode of Dasein that's founded upon being in the world. So epistemology is derived from an ontology of being in the world first and foremost and fundamentally, right? So thus being in the world as a basic state has to be interpreted beforehand. So you're going to see here in the next video after this one that Heidegger will then continue this analysis to look at the conception of the world as such, along with a number of other characterizations. I hope you can see that, by the way, the language of Heidegger is difficult here, but you can see there's no real other way to talk about this. And also, as we start employing this language, it slowly clarifies itself. Okay? So the next section we're going to be looking at is the worldhood of the world. So thank you guys very much for watching Phenomenology and Being in Time. I hope this has been enjoyable and that you're learning from this. This is a difficult text, and remember, there's no substitute for reading Heidegger for yourself. So don't forget to do that. So thanks again for watching online. I look forward to seeing you guys online.